What's up, everyone? It's Josh over here with the Manchise, and coming back to you this weekend with another UFC Fight Night card. This one's Derek Lewis versus Alexei Oleinik. Back at the Apex again, and hopefully this card is much better than last weekend's card, which was just a debacle. It was a complete disaster with the amount of fights that ended up being canceled, and then it just even got crazier on Fight Night when Kevin Holland and Trevin Giles, that fight got scrapped because Trevin Giles passed out. It ended up just being a terrible card all the way around. Only 8 fights. Was an impressive victory for Derek Brunson over Edmund Shabazian. That kind of screwed me over in some DFS lineups. But in all honesty, after all of those fights were scrapped, I wasn't expecting much. It was a complete wild card night. And let's just talk about FanDuel for a moment. FanDuel is a horrible sports book to play DFS on. The fact that they don't do like a late night swap, especially in the UFC. And then, right now we have the coronavirus and the pandemic going on. So the fact that they don't allow you to swap out your fighters in case of emergency, like we saw with Kevin Holland and Trevin Giles, is absolutely ridiculous. And that's why I'm a DraftKings guy. I do play on both platforms, but when it comes to MMA, I definitely prefer DraftKings. I just like the way that they do their salaries, to be honest. I think it's a little bit more difficult, at least for roster construction, than it is on FanDuel. So FanDuel, screw you guys for that. That's insane. DraftKings, you could at least swap out Kevin Holland or Trevin Giles if you had him in your lineup. The problem is you just didn't have many options because there were only 8 fights, and I think the Holland versus Giles fight was like the 5th fight on the card, 5th or 6th fight on the card. So, if you had exposure to later fights, it's not like you could swap anybody in there. And if you didn't have exposure to those later fights, you had just limited options because the first 5 fights or so were already finished, and it's not like you could take a fighter from there. So anyway, enough complaining about last week. Let's make some money this week on this Derek Lewis, Alexei Oleinik card. And we're going to start off in the bantamweight division, the first fight of the night. It's a fight between Irwin Rivera and Ali Al-Kaisi. Irwin Rivera is making his second fight in the UFC, but it's officially his bantamweight debut. He fought pretty recently. It was just 2 months ago where he took a short notice fight on just a few days. And he lost that fight to Giga Chikadze. That was just by unanimous decision. He was roughed up pretty bad in that one, but again, short notice fight. And he was fighting up a division. He was fighting in the featherweight division. He is a natural bantamweight. He will be taking on Ali Al-Kaisi, who is making his UFC debut, but he's on a nice little 5-fight win streak. Fought for Brave, so some decent competition over there. I had to familiarize myself with Ali Al-Kaisi, and what I saw I actually really like. Did some research on him. This guy is a master of Kung Fu. He also has a Sambo background. And he was successful within the Brave organization. Like I said, he's on that 5-fight win streak. He fought eight months ago, and he beat Jeremy Pacatall or Pacati. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that guy's name. He had a 9-3 record, and Al-Kaisi beat him via unanimous decision. Also had a victory a year ago in Brave against Georgia's Bardawil. Again, unanimous decision. And then he also had a few subs, guillotine choke, armbar submissions as well on his resume. Irwin Rivera, outside of the Giga Chikadze fight, this was a guy that held the belt over a Titan, pretty known organization. KO'd Danny Sabatello, KO'd Matt Wagey, Lazar Stojanovic, he knocked him out as well. So as you can see, Irwin Rivera has some power in those hands. And the one thing that I want to point out with that fight against Chikadze was he got head kicked a couple times in that fight and was able to survive. And that was pretty impressive. I think that was the one thing that I took away from that fight, is that Erwin Rivera has a chin. Rivera trains with the Burns brothers, Gilbert Burns, of course, and he's at a legitimate gym. He trains under Henry Hooft, which is one of the other things that I like to see. For Ali Al-Kaisi, he kind of moves around a whole bunch of different gyms. I know he did some jiu-jitsu with 10th Planet, so I think he also trained with Fortis for a little while. So he's a guy that's kind of moved around a little bit, but that's good because you're just gaining exposure and experience to not only different training partners but different coaches as well. If I'm looking at this fight, I'm going to pull up the odds. Erwin Rivera is minus 175, so Rivera opened up as a minus 200 favorite. Those odds have that gap is closed a little bit. And I'm not too surprised because I watched a lot of Al-Kaisi's fights, and from what I saw, I was really liking his style. I mean, he's a very well-balanced fighter. He's someone that likes to keep constant pressure, which is similar to Erwin Rivera, and I think that will really play out well in the smaller cage, in the Apex. But he's got pretty solid striking because he has that Kung Fu background. He's good in the clinch because he has a Sambo background. And where I think he really has an advantage in this fight over Erwin Rivera is on the ground. His submission skills are better than Rivera's. Just his grappling is, in my opinion, better. His BJJ is better than Erwin Rivera's. So, clear path to victory for Al-Kaisi, and that is to get this fight to the ground. And because they're fighting in a smaller cage, I think there's a good chance that could potentially happen. I don't think Al-Kaisi is going to knock out Erwin Rivera here. In fact, I think this fight probably goes the distance. But Erwin Rivera, and both of these guys are relatively unknown, but Erwin Rivera didn't impress me against Giga Chikadze, and I know he was moving up to the featherweight division, but I'm not very high on Giga Chikadze. I don't think he's ever going to be a top 15 fighter in the featherweight division, and it scares me that Rivera lost that fight to him. And again, it was an expected loss, but the way that he lost that fight, where Chikadze really just kind of pieced him apart and dismantled him from a striking perspective. So if I'm betting this fight, I like Al-Kaisi here at plus 155, plus 160, depending on where you're betting, hopefully not FanDuel. And then in DFS, Erwin Rivera is 8,900. And I don't know if that price point is warranted because, again, at that price point, you're expecting a finish. Could it happen in this fight? Absolutely. If there's going to be a finish, or I don't want to say a finish because I think Al-Kaisi could finish Rivera on the ground, but if there's going to be a knockout in this fight, it would be Erwin Rivera knocking out Al-Kaisi. I don't think it's likely. I think this does go the distance. So I'm going to avoid Erwin Rivera in my lineups over on DraftKings when putting together a DFS lineup here. But I will definitely have some ownership for Ali Al-Kaisi. And he's one of the cheapest fighters on this slate at 7,300. And I think it's a pretty solid price point there because Al-Kaisi does have some solid output. And, this fight's likely to go the distance. And if for some reason this fight goes to the ground, I think Al-Kaisi has a pretty big advantage there and could pull out a submission. That would be beautiful at a 7,300 price point if we could get an early finish from Al-Kaisi. And I don't think he's going to be high owned. I think he's going to be pretty low owned because it's his first UFC fight. He's relatively unknown. So go ahead and punch in Ali Al-Kaisi into some of your lineups. So we'll move on to the next fight here. This is Yusuf Zalal versus Peter Barrett. And this fight is taking place in the featherweight division. Peter Barrett is making his UFC debut. He did fight in the Contender Series where he had a decision victory over Sang-Hoon Yu. And that was about a year ago. Before that, He fought for Cage Titans, which is like a regional promotion. I believe that's in the Northeast somewhere in like the New England area. Peter Barrett is kind of back and forth in those fights though. A year ago, he beat Zach DiSabatino, knocked him out. He was subbed by Connor Barry, armbar, 2 years ago. Had a victory over Jay Ellis, rear naked choke victory, and I'm sure you don't know who Jay Ellis is, neither do I, but the guy has a 15-75 professional MMA record. That's insane, and that guy should probably just call it quits. And then he also lost to TJ Brown. He was subbed arm triangle choke. So as you can see, this guy is prone to being subbed. Now, I don't know if that happens in this fight against Zalal, but it scares me when a guy is losing fights in regional promotions. Despite the fact that he had some success on the Contender Series, it's not like he finished Hoon Yu in that fight, right? It went the distance. So that's a little bit scary. For Zalal, he's on a nice little 2-fight UFC win streak here with victories over Austin Lingo and most recently Jordan Griffin. That was just about a month ago. And that fight against Jordan Griffin was pretty impressive because he basically weathered the storm against Griffin. And then in the later rounds, he just put it on Griffin and prevented a ton of takedown attempts and was by far the more impressive striker in that fight. Youssef Zalal does have a little bit of a size advantage here. He's an inch taller and has a 2-inch reach advantage as well. He is the younger fighter. He's 10 years younger, and he is a pretty big favorite in this fight. When I look at the Vegas odds, Youssef Zalal is minus 450. Peter Barrett is plus 360, and that does not surprise me. I don't know if Youssef Zalal is able to finish and put away Peter Barrett, but I would be very surprised if Peter Barrett was able to win this fight. Zalal has that Muay Thai background, and his striking is super slick. The thing about Zalal is he controls the distance well. His footwork is really good. He's able to avoid shots, avoid takedowns. Very slippery fighter, which is funny because Peter Barrett's nickname is Slippery Pete. But, you know what you're getting out of Zalal in this fight. You don't really know what you're getting with Peter Barrett. I can tell you the one fight that I focused on was his fight 2 years ago against Connor Barry where he was subbed. Because in that fight, he was also outmatched from a striking perspective. As soon as that fight began, Connor Barry put on some pressure, landed a nice little flurry, and I think that led to Barrett being on his back foot for the rest of that round. But Barry really had an advantage when it came to grappling, and he was able to take Barrett down and have his way with him and eventually sub him. And as I mentioned, we see some submission losses on Barrett's resume. Barrett's definitely a hungry fighter coming into this fight, and Zalal has a super quick turnaround. It's only, he fought a month ago, so, there's a concern there. From a betting perspective, I wouldn't put any money on this fight. I expect Zalal to win. We haven't seen many finishes from him in the UFC. So, if I were to bet this fight one way or the other, I would bet the overs. I think this one will go the distance. But I think it's pretty safe to say here that Zalal wins this fight. I don't like Peter Barrett. Now, when we head over to DraftKings to look at things from a DFS perspective, this is where we're seeing the cheapest fighter on the slate, Peter Barrett, at $6,900, and the most expensive fighter, Youssef Zalal, at $9,300 as of now. And I say as of now because DraftKings hasn't released salaries yet for Kevin Holland, who is also on this card and is a pretty big favorite. And I expect him to be somewhere around Zalal's price point, $9,200, $9,300, something like that. When it comes to DFS, this week is a tricky week because there's a lot of close fights on this card. And in all honesty, I like a lot of the underdogs this week. So, at some point, you have to pay up for some fighters that you might not typically want to spend a ton of money on. And Yusuf Zalal is one of those guys, right? So he's priced up at 9,300, but if you look in his 2 UFC fights, he only scored 82 fantasy points and 65 fantasy points. And that's what I expect to see out of him here. Somewhere around 70 to 85 fantasy points against Peter Barrett, which isn't really what you want when you're going to pay 9,300. So Zalal won't be in my ideal lineup, but I may have a little bit of exposure to him, especially in cash games, because I think he's super safe to pull out a victory. Peter Barrett, who's a UFC unknown making his debut here, I don't expect to have any exposure to him, and it's just because I don't have any confidence that he can win this fight. So I will be avoiding Peter Barrett. I don't, again, no exposure to him over from a DFS perspective. So let's move on to the next fight on the card here, which is Justin Jaynes versus Gavin Tucker, and this fight will be taking place in the featherweight division. So we talked about Erwin Rivera, who's a guy that stepped up on short notice and fought Giga Chikadze, a weight class above what he typically fights. And Justin Jaynes is in the same boat here. He had his UFC debut a month ago against Frank Camacho, and that was just a complete card killer. If you didn't have Justin Jaynes in your lineup that night, you probably didn't cash. And on the flip side, Frank Camacho had a ridiculous ownership share. I know in the tournament that I played, if I can recall, it was somewhere around 65 to 70%. So if you had Camacho in your lineup, I think he had only landed 2 significant strikes before Jaynes knocked him out. You were done. Jaynes, from what I can tell, has some impressive striking, man. I didn't know too much about him going into that fight because he did take it last minute. But wow, did he have some power in his hands to put Camacho out the way that he did. And it makes sense, man. Jaynes actually coaches over at Extreme Couture, so he must know what he's doing. And he's now on a nice little win streak. He's won his most, let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4. He's on a 5-fight win streak. So before Camacho, he knocked out James Warfield Lane. He knocked out Brandon Noble. He subbed Devin Brown. I mean, the guy can finish, and that's what I like to see. And the other thing about Jaynes here is now he's going to be fighting at his natural weight class, which is featherweight. Over on the other side, we have Gavin Tucker fighting out of Canada, who was undefeated for quite a while. He won his UFC debut against Sam Cecilia. He looked really impressive in that one, but that was 3 years ago. Gavin Tucker has not been an active fighter. For whatever reason, I think some of that has to do with the weight cut. He's a pretty muscular guy for someone who's only 5'6". He did lose a fight to Rick Glenn. He lost that fight via decision unanimously, and Gavin Tucker was a pretty big favorite in that fight, and Rick Glenn just kind of outworked him. That's the fight that I really wanted to focus on when doing research on this fight, because that's a fight that you would expect a hot prospect, even though he's a little bit older. I mean, at the time he was 32 years old when he took that fight, but he was undefeated, to pull out a victory there. And to lose that fight to Rick Glenn, that shows a lot about a fighter. A year ago, he did fight Sung Woo Choi, and he subbed him rear naked choke. Sung Woo Choi, I don't know. I don't know how much we can take away from that fight. I mean, if I look at Sung Woo Choi, I just want to pull up some information about him. He's a guy that doesn't have a ton of UFC experience. I believe he's a Korean fighter, so I'm just pulling up his information right now. Professional record of 8-3. Yeah, I mean, he's 1-2 in the UFC. So he lost to Movsar Evelev. That was a super tough fight. Welcome to the UFC. Lost to Gavin Tucker, but he did beat Mokhtarian. Yeah, I mean, Gavin Tucker hasn't fought really a ton of great UFC competition, but that's okay here because he's fighting James, who's just in his second UFC fight. When I look at the Vegas odds in this one, Gavin Tucker is -135. The favorite, Justin James, is +115. I love James in this spot. I mean, this guy's just on a finishing streak here. Now, we haven't seen Tucker get finished yet in his professional career, but I think we might see it here. I mean, if James lands those shots, his left hook was so pretty in that fight against Camacho. It was a little bit loopy, so there's some concerns there. Was he throwing caution to the wind to just try to knock out someone since he was taking the fight on short notice and may not have had a full camp to build up his conditioning? Either way, if he lands those shots on Gavin Tucker, I would expect Tucker to go to sleep. So I really like Justin James at +115. When we look at this fight from a DFS perspective, actually, before we even do that, let's pull up some stats here on this fight, Gavin Tucker and Justin James, since they both have some UFC experience. Starting with Tucker, 2.66 significant strikes landed per minute, 37% striking accuracy, 4 strikes absorbed. For James, these numbers are absolutely insane. 23 significant strikes landed per minute, and that's because he finished the fight in a minute. 53% striking accuracy, and 5.8 strikes absorbed. These numbers don't really mean much for Justin James. For Gavin Tucker, takedowns 2 every 15 minutes, 33% takedown accuracy, 33% takedown defense. So those numbers aren't that great, but I don't look too much into those numbers because I expect this fight to stay standing. I don't know if James will attempt a takedown, especially after having so much success against Camacho, who's naturally 10 pounds heavier than him. 33% takedown defense, though, I still want to pay a little bit of attention to it, just because if this fight ends up in a clinch or there's a scramble, it just shows that Gavin Tucker doesn't have the best takedown defense, and Justin James may be able to take him down. So I really like Justin James here, as I mentioned. Let's pull this up from a DFS perspective. Justin James is 7,800. Gavin Tucker's 8,400. It makes sense since Vegas is viewing this as a pretty close fight. The thing with this slate is your high price point fighters don't have a ton of finishing potential, in my opinion, or they really have tough matchups, which is crazy to me because DraftKings sets these salaries really based on the Vegas odds. One of the fights that I just want to quickly point out is Nasrat Haqparast, right? He's a guy that's priced at 9,000 and definitely has some knockout power and finishing potential. He's fighting an undefeated prospect in Alex Munoz, who's got legit wrestling skills, and Haqparast has shown that he can be taken down. So, the only reason why I bring that up, because we're going to get more in detail on that fight, is that we want to, if you're playing a tournament, we want to locate fighters that have a chance to rack up a ton of points and get a finish. That's what we saw from James in his last fight when he put up 108 points against Frank Camacho. So I love him here in this spot, and I would expect to have a lot of exposure to James. For Gavin Tucker, even if you think he's going to win this fight, outside of that submission victory against Choi, haven't seen a ton of output from him in the UFC. He had 63 points against Sam Cecilia and 12 points against Rick Glenn, and that fight went all 3 rounds, 15 minutes. It went the distance. 12 points in 15 minutes is just dreadful. So I do not expect to have any Gavin Tucker ownership. I'm going to avoid Tucker, and I'm going to have a lot of exposure to Justin James. And I hope you follow me on that bandwagon. Moving on to the next fight here, we have Andrew Sanchez fighting Wellington Turman in the middleweight division. And this should be a pretty good fight. Both these guys, of course, have UFC experience. We'll start over with Andrew Sanchez, and again, middleweights. Andrew Sanchez is coming off of a loss 9 months ago to Marvin Vettori. That was a tough fight for him, man. Marvin Vettori is legit. He did have 2 victories, one against Marc-Andre Barriault and the other against Marcus Perez, who, by the way, Turman fought in his most recent UFC fight, so they do have a common opponent there. Andrew Sanchez was knocked out by Ryan James, and he was knocked out by Anthony Smith. Now, he fought Anthony Smith. I just want to take a look at that fight because I know Anthony Smith now fights light heavyweight. So, there's a little bit of a size discrepancy in that fight. On the other side of things, Wellington Turman, 8 months ago, beat Marcus Perez by unanimous decision. He lost a split decision to Carl Roberson in his only 2 UFC fights. But before that, the guy has a pretty solid record. His professional record now is 16-3. And of course, one of those losses was to Carl Roberson in the UFC. There is something I want to talk about in this fight, and that is both of these guys have a perfect 100% takedown defense in their UFC careers. Now, that's really impressive for Andrew Sanchez because he's had 5 or 6 UFC fights. But even for Turman, it's pretty impressive as well because he fought 2 pretty tough customers in Carl Roberson and Marcus Perez. Now, Vegas has Turman as a slight favorite in this fight. When I look at the odds here, Turman is minus 155, Andrew Sanchez is plus 135. And I agree with those odds. I would give the edge to Turman. And the reason why is because these guys are super similar fighters, but Turman definitely has an advantage striking. And I don't expect either of these guys having success taking down their opponent because we haven't seen them get taken down in the UFC yet. And when I look at their takedown accuracy numbers, they're not great, they're not horrible, but Sanchez is 33% and Turman is 37%. Sanchez averages 2.25 takedowns per 15 minutes. Turman averages 3 takedowns per 15 minutes. When it comes to striking, Sanchez is the more higher volume striker, 4.49 strikes landed per minute, 43% striking accuracy, 4.2 strikes absorbed. But, those numbers are a little bit misleading because if you look at some of those fights that Sanchez was in, those significant strikes were, he was racking up those strikes when he was able to take down his opponent and land some ground strikes. Turman, on the other hand, 2.43 strikes landed per minute, 42% striking accuracy, 3 strikes absorbed. These guys are similar across the board. They're similar in size. They're similar in reach. But I think Wellington Turman is the more well-rounded fighter. I think that he should be able to pull off a victory in this one, but I don't expect a finish either way in this fight. So I think this one definitely goes the distance. I like Turman at minus 160. When it comes to DraftKings, these guys are pretty close in price. Turman's 8,500. Sanchez is 7,700. I don't expect to have too much exposure to either one of these fighters just because I don't see a ton of finishing potential. If I look at Andrew Sanchez, 20 fantasy points, 85, 67, 83, 61, 67. The thing with Sanchez is he's been able to get takedowns in a lot of his fights, which of course is going to lead to fantasy points. 2 takedowns against Barriault, 4 against Smith, 3 against James. So Yeah, Andrew, I don't think we can rely on those takedowns in this fight. So it's going to come down to significant strikes. And Andrew Sanchez, there have been fights where he's put up a decent amount of strikes. 96 against Jane, 73 against Perez, 72 against Barrio. But there's also been fights where that number's been, significantly less. 39 strikes against Vittori, 31 strikes against Roundtree. Don't have a ton of interest in Andrew Sanchez. For Turman, more of the same, right? 54 points against Roberson, 67 points against Perez. I'm looking for more when I'm paying $8,500, especially in a fight that's pretty evenly matched. So I don't expect to have too much exposure one way or the other. If I had to have someone here, it would be Turman, because I think he's going to win the fight. And like I've talked about before, those 30 extra points for winning a fight go a long way. So we'll move on to the next fight here, which is Nasrat Haqparast versus Alex Munoz. I've already kind of alluded to how I feel about this fight a little bit earlier in this breakdown, but let's go into a little bit more detail here. Haqparast is 11-3, taking on Alex Munoz in the lightweight division, who has a record of 6-0. Haqparast coming off of a pretty vicious knockout loss to Drew Dober just 6 months ago. Haqparast was the favorite in that fight, and he was just outright starched. But Dober's been on a tear. Before that, he did have 3 victories in the UFC. He knocked out Joaquim Silva, decision victory against Thibaut Gouti, and he also had a victory against Mark Jacasey, which was impressive. He did lose a fight to Marcin Held, and one of the reasons why I want to point that out is because Marcin Held is not that good of a fighter, but Held was really able to have his way with Haqparast. He's able to take him down, kind of make it a boring fight, and the reason why I want to point that out is because that's kind of what I expect to happen here against Alex Munoz. So we saw Munoz on the Contender Series 2 years ago, where he beat Nick Newell, who you guys should be familiar with. He is the one-armed MMA fighter. I think Newell fought for Bellator. And Munoz just has ridiculous wrestling. Now, most of his victories have been by decision, but he also has a few rear naked choke subs. He does have a knockout against Jesse Moreno in smaller organizations. But, his most recent fights, 9 months ago against Troy Lamson, who had a record of 13-2. 2 years ago on the Contender Series, Nick Newell had a record of 14-1. Those were the fights that I really wanted to pay attention to. And I was super impressed with Alex Munoz and his wrestling ability. The guy's going to be, difficult to prevent from taking you down. And that's where I have some concerns with Haqparast here. Vegas has Haqparast as a pretty big favorite. He's minus 245. I don't agree with that at all because Munoz is undefeated now. Has he fought someone with the power of Haqparast? No. But in his six professional fights, he hasn't been finished. So we don't really know. I mean, that means that Munoz could have a really good chin, but it also could just mean it wasn't tested by UFC caliber power. So this is going to be a good litmus test for Alex Munoz. I guess the thing that I can't get out of my mind here is that fight against Marcin Held that Haqparast had. It just scares me that a guy like Marcin Held could kind of control that fight. And if Held can do that, then Munoz certainly can do that as well. I know that fight against Held took place close to 3 years ago, and hopefully Haqparast has evolved since then. But I don't know if I can confirm that because I think one of the things that led to Haqparast being knocked out by Drew Dober is the fact that Dober had a wrestling advantage in that fight, and he was able to feint those level changes and then ultimately knock out Haqparast. So I think Haqparast, it remains to be seen as to whether or not he's improved his wrestling. And if he hasn't, then this is a scary matchup for him. I would not feel comfortable betting this fight at minus 245 for Haqparast. I don't know if I'd be comfortable betting this fight for plus 205 for Alex Munoz either, because he's a wild card here and he doesn't have a ton of professional experience. But if I had to bet one way or the other, I would bet on Munoz, and probably by decision victory. Maybe he can pull out a submission, but I think if he's going to win this fight, it's because he's going to get it to the mat. He's going to be able to control Haqparast on the mat. And Munoz, I will say this, even though he doesn't have a ton of professional experience, he trains with Team Alpha Male. So he's fighting and training with, some of the best fighters out on the West Coast here in the United States. I want to look at this fight. Actually, let's look at some of the stats for this fight, because we might get some here for Munoz. Yeah, we do have some stats here since he fought on the Contender Series. So for Munoz, 4.07 significant strikes landed per minute, 63% striking accuracy, 3.53 strikes absorbed, 4 takedowns per 15 minutes, 66% takedown accuracy. That number is just, it's beautiful. On the flip side, for Haqparast, he has 5.25 significant strikes landed per minute, 47% striking accuracy, 3.38 strikes absorbed per minute, only 0.29 takedowns per 15 minutes, 25% takedown accuracy, 78% takedown defense. That number is actually pretty solid, but it's misleading because a lot of his fights, Jacasey, at the time he fought Jacasey 2 years ago, Jacasey was a pure striker. We weren't seeing a ton of takedown attempts there. When he fought Joaquim Silva, that fight stayed standing. Dover, he was knocked out really early on in that fight. The number is at 78% because of that Marcin-Held fight, where Held had some success taking him down. So when it comes to DFS, this is probably the trickiest fight on the slate. One of the trickiest. And the reason for that is because Haqparast is really enticing at that $9,000 price point because of that finishing potential. His fight against Jacasey, 93 significant strikes landed, 87 fantasy points. Against Guti, 124 significant strikes landed, 102 fantasy points. The early knockout against Silva, 91 fantasy points. So we can see that Nasrat Haqparast has the potential to finish this fight. I will probably have a little bit of exposure to Haqparast. I will probably also have a little bit exposure to Munoz because he's so cheap on this slate at 7,200. And if he is able to take down Haqparast 4 or 5 times and win the fight by decision, or even pull off a sub, he's definitely going to pay beyond that 7,200 price point. This fight to me is a toss-up. I know Vegas doesn't see it that way, but if I'm playing in tournaments, which I do, probably want to have a little bit of exposure each way. So my ideal lineup, which I give to you guys each week, what I think would be, for certain, you're going to win it, you're going to at least place it in a GPP or win in cash. I'm not going to have either one of these guys because I'm not really confident one way or the other. But I'm definitely going to have some GPP entries with exposure to both of these guys. And I'm really looking forward to this fight. So we'll move on to the next fight on this card, which was just recently announced. It's taking place in the middleweight division. It's Kevin Holland versus Joaquin Buckley. We already talked a little bit about Kevin Holland. He had a scheduled fight last weekend, which he was taking that fight on short notice against Trevin Giles. Now he's going to be taking this fight on short notice against Joaquin Buckley. Kevin Holland, 17-5. Most recently fought 2 months ago where he knocked out Anthony Hernandez. He did lose to Brendan Allen via submission. If you guys really want to see a bunch of detail on Kevin Holland, you can check out the most recent video. I talked a little bit about that fight against Brendan Allen, and Brendan Allen just has really good grappling and submission skills, so it was a tough opponent. But before that, we did see some nice victories that Holland was able to pull out in the UFC. He beat guys like John Phillips, subbed him. He was able to beat Gerald Meerschaert. He was able to beat Alessio Di Chirico. So Kevin Holland's a UFC veteran at this point. On the flip side, Joaquin Buckley fought 4 days ago in LFA. He knocked out Jackie Ghosh, who has an 8-2 record. And that scares me that there's going to be that quick of a turnaround here. The fight before that, he knocked out Chris Harris. And then he fought in Bellator 2 years ago, and he lost the fight to Logan Storley. I was able to check out that fight. Storley had a record of 7-0 at the time, and Storley's no joke, so tough matchup there. He did have some success with Bellator, though. He had a victory over Justin Patterson, victory over Vinicius de Jesus. I mean, when I watch Joaquin Buckley, the guy has legit power. I mean, that's all I can really say. If he lands a clean shot on your chin, he has the ability to put you out. Kevin Holland is the more well-rounded fighter. Kevin Holland has solid striking, has some power. He's got good wrestling, really good submission skills. So I think Kevin Holland has an advantage here just about everywhere. But one of the things that I want to pay attention to in this fight is size. Kevin Holland is 6'3", has an 81-inch reach. Buckley, 5'10", 73-inch reach. So though Buckley has that power, he's going to really need to pick his shots and get on the inside to land on Kevin Holland. I don't see that happening. And Vegas agrees with me. As of right now, Kevin Holland is opening up as a minus 450 favorite. So he's definitely one of the biggest favorites on this slate. I don't know if there's a ton of money to be made here unless you're going to bet on Kevin Holland getting the finish. And I don't hate that bet because we've seen Holland finish fights in the UFC. And because it's such a quick turnaround for Joaquin Buckley. I mean, the guy fought less than a week ago. It's just crazy. I just don't like to see it. I mean, how prepared can you be for an opponent in a few days? And I guess you could say that too about Kevin Holland because he's taking the fight on short notice as well. But the difference is he's had a training camp. He was preparing for the fight against Trevin Giles that was supposed to take place last week. DFS, this one's weird because this fight is so short notice that I don't even have salaries for it yet on DraftKings. But I do know how DraftKings likes to structure their salaries. They like to do it based on the Vegas odds. And based on the Vegas odds, I expect Kevin Holland to be one of the most expensive fighters on this slate. I would expect his price point to be anywhere from $9,200 to $9,500, somewhere in that range. And therefore, Buckley will probably be in the low sixes, maybe $6,800, $6,900. I'm going to avoid Buckley. And as soon as they announce or add this fight to the slate, I expect to have some Kevin Holland exposure here because he's a guy that I'm pretty confident in, and he's a guy that has finishing potential. You know, if you're going to pay $9,300 for Yusuf Zalal, why not just pay an extra $100 or $200 for Holland, who has shown that he has more finishing potential in the UFC? That's how I'm viewing it at this point. I don't think we'll see Kevin Holland's price point be beyond $9,500 though. I think we're going to see it $9,400, $9,500. So roll with Kevin Holland this week. I actually think this is an easier matchup against Buckley than it would have been against Giles. Even though Giles and Buckley kind of have similar styles. All right, so we're going to move on to the next fight here, which is taking place in the welterweight division, and it's Tim Means versus Laureano Staropoli. And Tim Means has been around for a long time, and he's been on the wrong end of a few decisions. I will say that. His most recent fight, though, he was subbed by Daniel Rodriguez. And I really like Daniel Rodriguez in that fight. That fight took place about 5-6 months ago. Daniel Rodriguez has some pretty nasty striking, stand-up. And he was able to hurt Tim Means and get him to the ground, sub him. Before that, Tim Means pulled off a submission of his own against Thiago Alves. He was knocked out by Nico Price. He knocked out Ricky Rainey. And he lost a split decision fight to Sergio Moraes. And that was one of those that was pretty damn close because Moraes probably landed the more significant strikes in that fight, but not a ton of output. So he is 2-3 in his 5 most recent UFC fights. On the flip side for Staropoli, he's only had 3 UFC fights, and he's 2-1. So his first fight, he won that by decision against Hector Aldana. He also beat Thiago Alves, so they have a common opponent there. But he lost his most recent fight to Muslim Salikov. That was a tough fight for him. I guess my takeaway from that fight is that Staropoli is a guy that a lot of people were very high on. Pretty big prospect coming into the UFC. Salikov was definitely a jump in the level of competition that Staropoli had seen up until that point, and it really showed. Salikov's striking was just so much more crisp. He was patient, and in the second round, he was able to start to pick apart Staropoli, and there were times where it looked like Staropoli was going to get finished in that fight. Now, he was able to tough it out, but, still took the L. Vegas has Staropoli as a favorite in this fight. Staropoli's -140, Means is +120. But let's talk about some things here. The first thing is I expect this fight to stay standing. Both these guys are guys that want to strike first. And Tim Means has some pretty crisp boxing skills. And as of recently, we've seen him introduce some Muay Thai, some kicking into his game, which is good. I think it's definitely diversified him as a fighter. If this fight were to go to the ground, Tim Means has a big advantage here. I just have more confidence in his submission skills. When I look at Staropoli and his victories as a professional, all of them are either by KO or TKO, or they went the distance. He's got one victory by Kimura, and that was very early on in his career against a guy that only had one professional fight. The other interesting that I want to point out here is a lot of the victories that Staropoli had early on before he was in the UFC were against guys with very little professional experience. And I'm not surprised because he's fighting out of Argentina and there's not a ton of mixed martial arts. You don't see a lot of fighters come out of Argentina. It's, they don't have promotions there with elite level talent. I guess the question becomes here, is Tim Means on the same level as Muslim Salikov? I don't think so. I think he's probably a notch below. But is he a notch above Thiago Alves and Hector Aldana and all the other guys that Staropoli has fought so far in his professional career? And I would say certainly. So it's interesting that Vegas has Staropoli as the favorite here. Might have to do with Means being 36 years old and just being in a bunch of wars. I would lean Means. I'm going to pull up some stats here so we can take a peek at those. Tim Means, striking stats, 4.87 significant strikes landed per minute, 45% striking accuracy, 3.44 strikes absorbed. For Staropoli, 4.29 strikes landed per minute, 31% striking accuracy, 4.22 strikes absorbed. And then when it comes to grappling, again, neither of these guys are looking for a takedown, but Tim Means has tried to diversify his game a little bit. 0.91 takedowns per 15 minutes, 44% takedown accuracy, 63% takedown defense. For Staropoli, 0.33 takedowns per 15, 25% accuracy on takedowns, and 50% takedown defense. You know, like I suspected, Tim Means probably has a little bit of a grappling edge here. You know, one of the other things I want to point out about Tim Means is we've seen that he's susceptible to the body shot. That does scare me a little bit in this fight. If Staropoli can hone in on that liver and land some big shots to the body, I think that's really his clearest path to victory. But if Means can keep this at a boxing distance, I like him here. And if it ever goes to the ground, I really like him. So if I were to bet this fight, I would bet this fight for Means at plus 115, plus 120. I don't feel comfortable taking Staropoli minus 140. I wouldn't be surprised if he won the fight, but I think this fight really is a toss-up. As I said, there's going to be a lot of close fights on this card. When it comes to DFS, Staropoli's 8,300, Tim Means is 7,900. So again, super close price points. Just want to pull up Tim Means. 26 points against Rodriguez, 112 against Alves, 24 against Price, 110 against Rainey, 75 against Moraes. I mean, if Tim Means gets to box and is able to, he doesn't get finished, and he's able to strike, we can see him put up some solid numbers. I mean, he had 91 strikes against Muhammad, 129 against Moraes. Those are fights that he lost, but he still put up decent fantasy point numbers. For Staropoli, on the other hand, 21 fantasy points against Salikov, 62 against Alves, 79 against Aldana. And we haven't seen any finishes from him in the UFC yet, so I don't love him in DFS, but I got to be honest, I don't really love either of these fighters. Maybe you could have a little bit exposure to Means. You think if he could pull off a sub, if this fight somehow goes to the ground. But I'm staying away from this fight. I'm definitely staying away from this fight because it's such a toss-up and neither of these guys have a ton of finishing potential. All right, so we are moving on to the main card, and we're going to kick things off in the lightweight division. 155 pounds, Beneil Dariush versus Scott Hot Sauce Holtzman. We'll start off with Beneil Dariush, who's on a nice little 4-fight win streak. Starting with his most recent fight against Drakkar Klose, who he knocked out. That was just 4 months ago, and that was a shocker to me, man, because Klose has looked like a killer so far in the UFC. An impressive knockout victory. He subbed Frank Camacho. He subbed Drew Dober. He also has a decision victory against Thiago Moises. And then the fight that, really had an impact, I think, on Dariush's trajectory in the UFC was that fight that took place 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, to Alex Hernandez, where he was knocked out cold. And Hernandez was just an unknown at that time. But it's nice to see that Dariush is back in the win column here with 4 straight victories. For Holtzman, 5 months ago, he had a decision victory against Jim Miller. He was able to knock out Dong Hyun Ma. Actually, it wasn't a knockout. That was a TKO. I think it was doctors stepped in and called that fight off. He lost the fight decision to Nick Lentz. And then before that, he beat Daryl Horcher by decision and knocked out Alan Patrick. And that was with elbows, I believe. It's pretty vicious elbows. This is an interesting fight for me because Scott Holtzman, when I watch him fight, I see the potential for him to be a really good fighter. He's got solid striking, solid wrestling. He's pretty well-rounded. But that fight against Nick Lentz, I keep going back to. You can't lose that fight to Nick Lentz. I know Lentz has tons of experience, but he's pretty much just a journeyman gatekeeper at this point. And Holtzman's 36 years old, so he's no spring chicken himself. And at 36 years old, he needs to stamp a pretty big victory over a notable opponent if he's ever going to make a run here in the UFC. Now, his most recent fight against Jim Miller, it was an impressive victory, but Miller's an old veteran, and I know Miller, he's a guy that's always dangerous because he has really good submission skills and solid wrestling, but Holtzman was able to negate the wrestling in that fight, but he wasn't able to finish Miller standing. For Beneil Dariush, he's just been on a nice little streak here. Like, when you have victories over Drew Dober and Drakkar Klose, I got to start paying attention to you again. And that's really how I felt about Beneil Dariush up until the point where he lost to Michael Chiesa. But even when he lost to Michael Chiesa, he was able to beat James Vick, who was looking like a killer at the time, and Rashid Magomedov. So, when I look at the competition that Beneil Dariush has faced, Drakkar Klose, Drew Dober, Edson Barbosa, James Vick, Michael Chiesa, Michael Johnson, Jim Miller, Diego Ferreira, Anthony Rocco Martin. This guy has fought the who's who in the lightweight division. And that's why I really have to give him an edge here. He's the favorite in Vegas's eyes as well. He's minus 165. Actually, that number has gone up. Let me take a look. Yeah, so he's now minus 175. And I like Dariush in this fight, man. And he's one of the guys that I'm pretty confident in. Holtzman just hasn't faced the level of competition that Dariush has faced. Holtzman, I want to pull up some stats here for this fight, because what I really am interested in looking at is grappling. Because I know Holtzman has a wrestling background, 2.23 takedowns per 15 minutes, 60% takedown accuracy, 65% takedown defense. So those numbers are pretty nice. But if you look at Dariush, 1.8 takedowns per 15 minutes, 33% accuracy, but this is the big number, 80% takedown defense. Holtzman is not going to finish Dariush in this fight. Holtzman only wins this fight if he's able to win in the wrestling department, because Dariush will have an advantage in the striking as well. Dariush has an 80% takedown defense, and he's fought some really good fighters and some guys with good wrestling backgrounds as well, like Drew Dober. So I think it's going to be difficult for Holtzman here to get Dariush to the mat. When it comes to striking, the numbers are pretty close. Dariush close to 4 significant strikes landed per minute, 49% striking accuracy, 2.5 strikes absorbed per minute. For Holtzman, 4.5 strikes landed per minute, significant strikes that is, 49% striking accuracy, 3.33 strikes absorbed. Again, even though the numbers are close, Dariush has fought much more difficult competition. I think Dariush wins this fight. He's got a size advantage as well. He's an inch taller. He's got a couple inch reach advantage. He fights out of a southpaw stance. I think Dariush wins this fight. I think he could also finish Holtzman here. Even though Holtzman has proven to be pretty durable, in fact, he's never lost, or he's never been finished. It's funny, he fought Josh Emmett back in the day, who's a super powerful puncher. But, Emmett fights down at featherweight. So, and even though he's powerful, he's one of the shorter fighters in that weight class. So, I expect Dariush to get a victory here, and I see a possibility for a finish. When it comes to DraftKings DFS, Dariush is 9,100. That's interesting to me. That number is telling to me. When I look at the Vegas odds and I see that Dariush is only minus 175, it's interesting to me that he would be 9,100 on DraftKings, because there are fighters that are bigger favorites that are cheaper on this slate. That might push some of the ownership away from Dariush, but for me, that stands out. That's something that I want to get involved in. And I look at Dariush's most recent performances: 94 points against Close, 110 against Camacho, 111 against Dober, 87 against Moises. I'm definitely putting him in my lineup. Definitely will have a ton of exposure to Dariush. For Holtzman, 7,100. If you think that Holtzman can take Dariush to the ground, then you need to have Holtzman in your DFS lineup. Because at that 7,100 price point, that's really juicy for a fighter that is only, plus 145, plus 155. Usually you're going to have to pay a little bit more for fighters with those odds. So I don't believe that he'll be able to take down Dariush. So I don't think I'll have a ton of exposure to Holtzman. I may have a little bit in a couple GPP lineups, but again, I don't like. I don't think a ton of favorites. As I mentioned earlier, like, this is a weird card for me. There's a lot of close fights. I lean for a lot of the underdogs here. Dariush is a favorite that I think will win, so I'm going to have some ownership there. But I might have one or two lineups that have Holtzman mixed in just to cover my bases. So move on to the next fight on the main card here. This is a fight that's taking place in the female bantamweight division, 135 pounds. Yana Kunitskaya versus Julia Stoliarenko, fighting out of Lithuania, who's also making her UFC debut. Real quick, before we break down everything there is to break down with this fight, I want to point out two things. The first thing is, can I continue to be wrong about these female fights? I mean, I did hit the nail on the head with Lipsky a couple weeks ago, but on the most recent card, I was all over JoJo Calderwood. She let me down and got armbarred. I was all over Molly McCann. She lost the fight. I mean, I just feel like I can't get these female fights right. So whatever analysis I have for you here, take it with a grain of salt. But you should do what I try to do, and that's avoid these female fights from a DFS perspective, if I can, because I just feel like there's so many variables and you just don't know what's going to happen. And the reason why I say that is because I think size plays a huge part in these female fights, whereas you could have a fighter that's more skilled and has better technique, but if they are 2 inches shorter or have less reach or aren't as physically strong, that tends to rear its ugly head more often in the female fights than in the male fights. If two guys are fighting and there's a fighter that is much bigger but doesn't have a technique or striking advantage or wrestling advantage or whatever it may be, it's typically difficult to close that gap, or more difficult to close that gap with just pure athleticism, physique, and size than it is against the women. So I think that's where I'm struggling. And I go back to that Molly McCann fight. And I think she was probably a better technical fighter. Same with JoJo Calderwood. I think she's a better technical fighter than Maya, but those fighters, with Maya, she was able to she was stronger. She armbarred Calderwood, got her in a bad position. So that's the first thing I want to point out. That's the end of my rant. Second thing that I want to point out is, if you don't know who Julia Stoliarenko is, one, she is a jiu-jitsu expert. That's her expertise. Two, go look at her most recent fight that took place 4 months ago against Lisa Verzosa. And it's on YouTube. You can look that fight up. Talk about a bloody war. Probably one of the best female fights that I have ever watched. And Verzosa was undefeated at the time, and that fight mostly stayed standing. which just shows you that Stoliarenko has some striking ability. Now, she's got a professional record of 9-3-1. Nice little 5-fight win streak here. Most of those victories have been armbar submissions. That's where she makes her money. She's like kind of like, a little bit like a Ronda Rousey. Will she be able to pull that off against Yana Kunitskaya, who has some UFC experience here against tough competition? This is a girl that fought Cyborg. This is a girl that fought Aspen Ladd. Now, she was knocked out in those fights, but it wasn't like, a 30-second first-round finish. She was difficult to get out in those fights. And then, of course, she has 2 victories, one against Lena Landsberg and the other against Marion Renault. I don't know. Now, Vegas seems to think that Yana Kunitskaya is a sizable favorite here at minus 235. And I understand that because she's just fought tougher competition. She's the more experienced fighter. If I had to lean one way or the other in this fight, I would give the advantage to Kunitskaya. But if there is a finish in this fight, if a finish takes place, I will ensure you that it will be Julia Stoliarenko that gets that finish, and it will be by submission and most likely by armbar. So, when it comes to DFS and DraftKings, first of all, don't play this fight. If you're playing cash, you don't want any involvement in this fight. If you're playing tournaments, avoid Kunitskaya altogether. We haven't seen any finishes from her in the UFC, and we don't see a ton of output in fights that she's lost. She only landed 5 significant strikes against Cyborg, 47 against Ladd. Like I said, she was a tough out in that fight. She eventually got TKO'd, but, and then her 2 victories against Renault and Landsberg, she did land 98 significant strikes against Renault, had 84 fantasy points. But against Landsberg, she had the 5 takedowns, so she did rack up 97 fantasy points. I don't think her game plan in this fight is going to be to take down Stoliarenko. If I'm her coach, I'm telling her to keep this at a striking distance. Don't go to the ground with this girl. So don't bet on getting a bunch of points for takedowns in this fight. If you're going to play GPP tournament, Stoliarenko is someone you want to target. Why? Because of that submission finishing ability that we could potentially see. Stoliarenko, though she's not as experienced as Kunitskaya, she was on The Ultimate Fighter. She lost to Pani Kinzad. Now, if Kunitskaya fought Pani Kinzad, what do you think would happen? I think Kunitskaya would probably win that fight. Which, makes sense that Vegas views her as the favorite. But we saw on The Ultimate Fighter, she also had an armbar victory. So, this is tough. This is really a tough one. Stoliarenko made it to the finale. When she was on The Ultimate Fighter, she ultimately lost that fight to Leah Letson. For GPPs, you can get a little bit of exposure to Stoliarenko. I don't want any exposure to Kunitskaya. If I'm betting this fight, I'm probably not going to bet this fight. If that makes sense. If I'm betting this fight, I'm not betting this fight. If you have to, lean Kunitskaya, but don't feel comfortable. And you might just want to fade me and go the opposite with whoever I select. So we'll move on to the next fight here, which is taking place in the middleweight division between Darren Stewart and Maki Pitolo. Of course, that's 185 pounds. And these guys might be just mirror images of themselves, right? Both these guys are just strikers. You have Coconut Bombs versus the Dentist. We'll start off with Darren Stewart, who has a record of 11-5. He Fought for Cage Warriors most recently. Lost to Bartosz Fabinski, decision unanimously. The UFC's calling his number again here, which makes sense because his 2 fights before that in the UFC, he beat Deron Winn, split decision victory, not impressive. And he also beat Bevin Lewis. I think that fight was more indicative of Darren Stewart's skills. And, he's got a victory over Charles Byrd. He was able to knock him out. And he lost the split decision to Edmund Shabazian, who we just saw last week get absolutely murked by Brunson. Darren Stewart he's a weird one for me to break down, man, because I look at his power and some of his striking ability, and, it's like, how's this guy not knocking out everybody? And, when you watch that Deron Winn fight, that's what bothers me. Deron Winn has a chin, but that fight was back and forth, and Stewart really should have fared off better in that fight, in my opinion. For Maki Pitolo, he's coming off of a victory about 2 months ago where he knocked out Charles Byrd as well. So common opponent. Both of these guys knocked out Charles Byrd. Shout out to Charles Byrd. And then in his UFC debut, he lost to Callan Potter by decision, which is a tough one. I think he really just gassed himself out in that fight. He landed some big shots in the first round, but Potter was able to weather the storm and ultimately win the fight. Pitolo, of course, is a Contender Series guy. Had a knockout against Justin Sumter in the Contender Series about a year ago. So that's why they call him Coconut Bombs. These guys are similar in stature. Stewart's got an inch or 2 in height, but their reach is about the same. The odds here are pretty close. Vegas is viewing Stewart as a minus 155 favorite. Pitolo's minus 135. I like Pitolo in this fight. If Pitolo can control his gas tank, I think he's the more powerful puncher. I think he's the more accurate puncher, which, let's see if I'm right on that. Let's pull up the stats. They're pretty damn close, but I am right. So let's look at some of the numbers here. Maki Pitolo, 5.22 significant strikes landed per minute, 45% striking accuracy, 2.98 strikes absorbed. For Stewart, 2.94 significant strikes landed per minute, 44% striking accuracy, 2.44 strikes absorbed per minute. When it comes to grappling, 2 takedowns per 15 minutes for Pitolo, 60% takedown accuracy, 33% takedown defense. For Darren Stewart, 1.38 takedowns per 15 minutes, 44% takedown accuracy, 65% takedown defense. I expect this fight to remain standing. Stewart could grapple, especially if he's hurt. His takedown accuracy, 44%, is pretty solid. I wouldn't say he's the greatest wrestler, but I feel the same way about Pitolo with his 60% accuracy. I don't think he's a great wrestler either. I'm going to say, if I'm betting this fight, I'm betting Maki Pitolo. Plus 150, no, what is he at this point? Plus 135. So you can see the spread's already adjusted there. If this fight were to end up in a finish, and I think there is a decent chance that occurs, because I expect these guys to really just go at it, I just think I trust Pitolo's power more. I trust his striking more here. So when it comes to DFS, as you could assume, I really like Maki Pitolo at that 7,600 price point. You know, he just put up a 106 spot against Charles Byrd a few months ago. His other fight against Potter, even though he took a loss there, he still landed 60 significant strikes, had about 40 fantasy points. It's not going to kill you if you're paying for somebody in the 7,000s. For Darren Stewart, you got to pay all the way up to 8,600 to get him in your lineup. And I don't think it's worth it. 64 points against Wynn, 45 against Bevan Lewis, 22 against Shabazian. He had the knockout victories against Bird and Spicely stinks. So, yeah, other than those 2 knockouts, Darren Stewart's not putting up a ton of points. Now, 8,600, you want to see at least 65, 70 points from him. If it goes the distance, that could happen. But I just think that if it goes the distance, it's just as likely Pitolo wins than Stewart wins. And if this fight ends in a finish, I would give Pitolo the advantage. Not to say that Stewart could finish him, but really when it all adds up, I'm much more comfortable paying $7,600 for Maki Pitolo than Darren Stewart. So again, if you want to diversify your lineups, you can get a little bit of ownership to both of them because this is a good fight to target. But for me, I will definitely have more exposure to Maki Pitolo. All right, so we're going to move on to the co-main event here, just taking place in the middleweight division. Chris Weidman versus Amari Akhmedov. And this is interesting to me because Chris Weidman typically, well, I don't want to say typically because he's actually bounced back and forth, but most recently fought at light heavyweight. And that was not a good idea for Chris Weidman. But, Chris Weidman's a big middleweight, man. And I think the thinking behind that was this is a guy that has gotten knocked out and finished in a lot of fights. And maybe the weight cut has to do with his durability. So in his most recent fight, they bump him up to fight at light heavyweight against Dominic Reyes, who we now know is a damn good fighter. And what happens? He gets knocked out and finished again. So now he's going to jump back down, make that difficult weight cut to 185, and fight Amari Akhmedov, who's on a nice little win streak here in the UFC. His professional record stands at 20-4. He is 4-0-1 in his 5 most recent fights. Victories over Ian Heinisch, Zach Cummings, Tim Bosch, and Abdul Razak Al Hassan. They all went the distance. He did have a draw against Marvin Vettori, which of course went the distance. What I will say about Amari Akhmedov is that he is not a flashy fighter. He's a grinder. But he's a pretty damn good fighter. He's a decision merchant, which is not what I like to see when I'm playing DFS. But he's a guy that's a tough out, man. If you can survive Al Hassan and Marvin Vettori, then I know you got a chin and you're pretty durable. He has been knocked out in the UFC before he went on this win streak here. He lost to Zaleski dos Santos and Sergio Moraes. He also was choked out by Gunnar Nelson. But this is a guy that's really been in the UFC for a while now and is now working his way up to potentially being in contention for a title shot in the 185-pound division. For Chris Weidman, do we have to really go over the 5 fights? I mean, I will, just because it's my job, but if you know anything about the UFC, you know about Chris Weidman, and if you pay any attention, you know that he's been on a little bit of a roller coaster ride here. It started about 4 years ago when he was knocked out by Luke Rockhold and lost the belt. Knocked out by Yoel Romero. Knocked out by Gegard Mousasi. He did sprinkle in a victory against Kelvin Gastelum. He choked him out with an arm triangle. And then he fought Jacare and was knocked out again, TKO'd. And then in his most recent fight was knocked out by Dominic Reyes. So this is a guy that in his 6, he's been finished in 5 of his last 6 Chris Weidman, if Chris Weidman gets finished by Omari Akhmedov here, he needs to retire. And there's no shame in it. He's 36 years old. He's a former champion. Everyone loves him because of the victories that he had against Anderson Silva. But I am even surprised that he's still fighting at this point. His chin just doesn't hold up. He's never going to make a run at a title again. So what's the point at this point? Why are you still fighting? Now, with all of that being said, Chris Weidman is the favorite in this fight. And that just shows you two things. The first thing, it just shows you the level of competition that Weidman has lost to, right? It's like, oh, he's been finished 5 out of his last 6 fights. But who was finishing him? It's not like it was any Joe Blow schlepper off the streets. It's guys like Dominic Reyes, Jacare, Mousasi, Yoel Romero, Luke Rockhold. These are all, top 5 fighters, or at one point were top 5 fighters in their division. The second thing that it also shows you is that Omari Akhmedov isn't a guy with a ton of finishing potential. And it makes sense because the last finish he had was all the way back in 2013 against a guy by the name of Thiago Perpetuo. That was his last finish in the UFC. All of his other victories have been by decision. So, this is actually a great matchup for Chris Weidman. When this fight was first announced, I was just like, oh, Omari Akhmedov is gonna beat him. And I don't know if I feel that way still. This is just such a toss-up fight for me, and that's why the odds are the way that they are. -135 for Weidman, +115 for Akhmedov. But let's take a look at some stats here, and maybe this will help me lean one way versus the other. Starting with striking, Omari Akhmedov, 2.99 significant strikes landed per minute, 34% striking accuracy, 2.77 strikes absorbed. For Chris Weidman, 3.14 significant strikes landed per minute, 42% striking accuracy, 3.25 strikes absorbed. When it comes to grappling, Akhmedov, 2.4 takedowns per 15, 50% takedown accuracy, 62% takedown defense. For Weidman, 3.82 takedown average for 15-minute fights, 50% accuracy on his takedowns, and 73% takedown defense. These guys are like mirror images of each other when you're looking at the statistics. So, it's not making things any easier diving into the stats. And the tough thing is usually Chris Weidman has a wrestling advantage in the majority of his fights. Like even in the fights where he was knocked out, it's because those fights remained standing and he was TKO'd. He just wasn't as good of a striker. The one fight where you really saw that wrestling advantage take place recently was the fight against Gastelum, where he was able to take him down and ultimately submit him. The thing is, Gastelum is a super small middleweight. Like, the guy's 5'9", has a really short reach, so the only way he's going to land strikes on Weidman, who's 6'2", with a 78-inch reach, is to get on the inside, which leaves him susceptible to the wrestling. We don't have that here in the Akhmedov fight. Not to mention, Akhmedov's from Dagestan, and he's got a great grappling background. Like, we saw that in that fight against Al Hassan. Like, he just clinched with Al Hassan and wore him down and ultimately won the fight. I don't think either of these fighters have the ability to really take the other fighter down. On top of that, I don't want to say they don't have the ability, but I don't expect to see one fighter dominate in the wrestling department. But on top of that, neither of these guys are the flashiest of strikers. If I'm going to give a striking edge to one fighter over the other, it would be to Akhmedov. I think he's a little bit more, I'd hate to use the term technical with Akhmedov's striking, but his striking's cleaner. Weidman may have a power advantage, but what I think we're going to see here is a really uneventful 15-minute fight where Chris Weidman actually survives and goes the distance. I think this is going to go to the judges' scorecard, and who knows how it ends up. We could see a split decision victory one way or the other. So, I would advise you not to bet this fight. If you're going to bet this fight, you have to bet Omari Akhmedov. You cannot take Chris Weidman. I don't care the amount of competition that this guy faced. If you've been finished 5 out of your most 6 recent fights, you would have to be a nitwit, completely insane, to lay some big coin on Chris Weidman, or you know something that I don't know. It's possible. If you're going to bet this fight, bet Akhmedov. But again, I don't know if I'd feel super confident about that either. Man, this is a tough one. I think this is going to be a sloppy striking fest of a co-main event that I really don't want any parts in. I don't want any parts from a DFS perspective either, because Weidman's 8K, Akhmedov's 8,200, so there's your 8,200, 8,000. You see that every week on DraftKings, and it's always pick your poison in that fight. This week, I'm actually feeling good about it because I don't want to have any exposure to it either way. It's not like a Paul Craig-Antigulov fight where it's like, oh, one of those guys could get a finish, and I need to get a little bit of exposure to both guys. Nope, I'm avoiding this fight at all costs. I will not have any exposure to Omari Akhmedov. I will not have any exposure to Chris Weidman. There are tons of other potentially close fights on this card that I can get a better read on. If you're playing GPP tournament, you could throw Akhmedov in your lineup for the sheer fact that Weidman is susceptible to being finished. So who knows? Maybe Akhmedov is able to finish Weidman. And we haven't seen it recently. 71 fantasy points, 62 fantasy points, 56 fantasy points, 26 fantasy points, 95, 63, 36. I mean, you're just not getting a ton of points from Akhmedov. And for Weidman, go ahead and put that guy in your lineup. Please. I hope I'm in the same tournaments as you. Because when he gets finished, it's not pretty. 7 points against Reyes, 39 against Souza, 33 against Mousasi, 11 against Romero, 51 against Rockhold. So that's the one outlier there outside of the Gastelum fight that he was able to sub him because he just absolutely dominated him in his wrestling, which is the whole reason why I told you guys a couple weeks ago, lock Jack Hermanson in your lineup. Not to toot my own horn, but I was completely right about that one. So yeah, if you want to put Akhmedov in your lineup, go ahead and be my guest. I won't be that guy though. Let's just move on to the main event. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse on that fight, but I do think it's one of the more interesting ones just because it's Weidman, right? So let's talk about this heavyweight bout. And let's just go back to the beginning of this video where I said there's a couple interesting fights on this card. The main event and the co-main event were the other two that I were referring to. Weidman and Akhmedov, and now this one between Derek Lewis and Alexei Oleinik. But this fight's interesting for a completely different reason. This fight's interesting because I feel like if you're playing DFS, you need to have some exposure to this fight. So we have Derek the Black Beast Lewis, who's one of my favorite fighters, always entertaining, taking on Alexei Oleinik in the heavyweight division. Derek Lewis is 23-7. Oleinik is 59-13. It's always hilarious when I see that record. Derek Lewis is coming off of 2 victories, both by decision. One against Blagoy Ivanov, the other against Ilir Latifi. Before that, he had 2 losses. He was knocked out by JDS, and he was subbed by Daniel Cormier. It was a tough fight for Derek Lewis there. And then before those fights, that was when the Black Beast was just on a knockout streak there where he finished Volkov, he finished Marcin Tybura, he finished Travis Brown, Shamil Abdurakhimov. Now, I left out the Ngannou fight. He beat Ngannou. That's because Ngannou was just scared to engage with him. But yeah, I mean, we know what the Black Beast is, right? He's a knockout artist with some of the heaviest hands in the UFC. For Alexei Oleinik, just 2 months ago, beat Fabricio Verdum by split decision. And really, he beat him with his striking, which is crazy. But it kind of makes sense, right? When you have two really good jiu-jitsu practitioners fighting each other, it kind of negates their jiu-jitsu and the fight goes somewhere else. And that fight just ended up being kind of a striking match, at least initially, and Oleinik landed the bigger shots. Before that, he subbed Maurice Green, armbar. He also took 2 L's, was knocked out by a flying knee to Walt Harris, and he was knocked out from a knee and then eventually ground and pounded by Alistair Overeem. The thing with Oleinik is we know that his jiu-jitsu skills are legit. He's got that Ezekiel choke that we've seen him lock in on some fighters here in the UFC. Victor Pesa, Junior Albini. That's his move, man. That Ezekiel choke, and it's a weird one. It's rare. You don't see it a lot. This is your classic striker versus grappler matchup. And who do we give the edge to in this fight? Well, let's start to break down some of the stats here, and then maybe that'll shed some light on who I'm going to roll with in this fight. Alexei Oleinik striking, 3.72 significant strikes landed per minute, 50% striking accuracy, 3.3 absorbed per minute. 2.41 takedowns on average for Oleinik, 46% accuracy on his takedowns, 35% takedown defense. For Derek Lewis, 2.53 significant strikes landed per minute, 49% striking accuracy, 2.14 strikes absorbed per minute, 0.48 takedowns per 15 minutes, 24% takedown accuracy, 53% takedown defense. So, the thing is, we all know Derek Lewis is not a high output fighter and he's had problems with conditioning in the past. But in his 2 most recent fights, he looked much better when it came to his conditioning and really diversifying his striking. We actually saw him throw in some head kicks and leg kicks, calf kicks. I don't know if I want to see that from him in this fight against Oleinik because that will leave him vulnerable to the takedown. Derek Lewis has solid takedown defense. Like that 53% number doesn't look great, but he has improved drastically in the UFC. And one of the reasons why that number looks so bad is because Daniel Cormier just ragdolled him. Really, outside of the Cormier fight, there hasn't been too many fights where Derek Lewis was ragdolled to the ground. So I actually like Derek Lewis in this fight because of that knockout power. And if Oleinik, coming off of a victory against Verdum where he had some success striking, thinks that that is going to translate here in this fight, he is in for a rude awakening. Like, if Walt Harris knocks you out, what do you think Derek Lewis is going to do? When Alistair Overeem knocks you out, what do you think Derek Lewis is going to do when that lunch pail of a fist lands on your chin? So we've seen Oleinik be susceptible to these knockouts against other heavy strikers like Overeem and Walt Harris. And here we are again throwing him into the ring against a big-time striker. And his victories in the UFC, really the best striker that he was able to beat, I believe, was Mark Hunt. Yeah, it was Mark Hunt. He was able to beat Mark Hunt, who, 40-something-year-old Mark Hunt. So I think Derek Lewis flatlines Alexei Oleinik in this fight. I'm a little bit worried with the leg kicks, like I mentioned. That could, lead to him being susceptible to the takedown, but hopefully the coaches get in his ear here and say, hey, keep this standing. Make Oleinik pressure you. When he does pressure you, land those big strikes, and let's finish this guy and get out of here early. And for that reason, if I were to bet this fight, I would agree with Vegas here that, Derek Lewis is minus 200, And I could put a little bit of money on Derek Lewis in this fight. Really, I think the big one here that I would bet is that this fight ends in a finish. Which those odds aren't great, but maybe you could do the over-under minus 1.5. I mean, under 1.5. Those odds are minus 105, so they're pretty decent. Because if this fight does get to the ground, I think Oleinik will probably tap Derek Lewis. I don't expect it to go there as long as Derek Lewis is smart, and we've seen him be smart in his last 2 fights. I guess one of the other things that I want to point out in this fight is, well, if Derek Lewis is such a big puncher, how come he couldn't finish Latifi? How come he couldn't finish Ivanov? Well, Ivanov is a savage. Like, if you don't know who Blagoy Ivanov is, you need to check him out. The guy has a friggin' chin. And Latifi is a solid dude as well. So, those are tough guys to finish in the UFC. Oleinik doesn't have the same chin that Ivanov has, or even Latifi. So if I'm betting this fight, I lean Derek Lewis. When it comes to DraftKings and DFS, I'm all over Derek Lewis in this one. Again, I'm chasing the finishing potential here. Now I guess the question could become, who's more likely to pull off a finish here, Derek Lewis or a guy like Haqparast? To me, it's Derek Lewis. Just because I'm scared of Haqparast's wrestling and takedown defense. Am I scared of Oleinik's jiu-jitsu? Yes, but he's got to get Lewis to the ground first, and Lewis is a big boy. He ain't easy to take down. Really, only Daniel Cormier has had immense success taking down Derek Lewis. Now, the issue is Derek Lewis isn't a high-volume striker, so if he doesn't get the finish, you're going to look at some ugly scores. 40 points against Latifi, 54 against Ivanov, right? We know he got beat by Dos Santos and Cormier, so he didn't do anything there. But, it's the knockouts. It's the 80 points against Volkov. It's the 91 against Tabura. It's the 103 against Brown that you're really looking for. And that's what I'm hoping we see out of Derek Lewis here. Because if it goes the distance, 40, 50, 55 points isn't what I'm looking to get out of a fighter I'm paying $8,700 for. You can have some exposure in this fight though, because Vegas sees this fight as it ending in a finish, and fights that end in a finish you want to have exposure to. So I expect a lot of people to have exposure to Oleinik at $7,500. I'm probably going to have some lineups with both of those guys. If you're playing, you could even do a stack here if you think it's really going to end in the first round and guarantee yourself about 100 points. I wouldn't recommend it, but there's crazier ideas. I'll mostly have exposure to Derek Lewis, but I'll have a few lineups with Oleinik as well. All right, man, that wraps up all of the fight breakdowns, analysis, predictions, rants about FanDuel and how shitty of a sports book they are. Let's get to our money-making segment. Have nothing to say about last week. You can't blame me if my lineup didn't cash last week because I had fighters that didn't even end up fighting. So, I'll take the L on the Shabazian, but I did point out some big upsets on that card. I told you about Cody Durden. I said you got to fade Chris Gutierrez. That was one of them, and there was a couple others. I talked about Jamal Emmers. I know he had a replacement opponent, but he put in work. So anyway, enough with last week. Let's move on to this week. Let's talk about how we're going to make some money this weekend on this card. And I'm going to go over what my ideal lineup is, and we're going to start with the cheapest fighters, make our way up to the most expensive fighters. And I hate having first fight exposure, but I will have some first fight exposure here, and it's Ali Al-Casey at 7,300. I really like him there, and if you don't like him, that's cool. Plug in Alex Munoz. You can do that as well. I wouldn't mind if you plugged in Alex Munoz, but I think Ali Al-Casey has a weaker opponent than Alex Munoz, and I think this is a safe pick against Irwin Rivera. I think this is a fight that goes the distance, which might not sound great when you're talking about GPPs and tournaments, but I think a lot of these fights are going to go the distance. And if this fight goes to the ground, don't be surprised if our boy Al Casey wraps up a guillotine choke or, head and arm triangle, something along those lines, and gets a finish. So, Ali Al Casey at 7,300. Next fighter here is going to be Maki Pitolo at 7,600. Coconut bombs. We're looking for him to finish Darren Stewart. That's what it comes down to. I think he's a better striker than Stewart. I think he knocks him out. 7,600, that's what I'm looking for. After Maki Pitolo, we're going to go with our boy Justin James. Call it recency bias since his last performance was so impressive, but he's just been, it goes beyond his last performance, man. He's just been on a finishing tear, even though it was outside the UFC. And I think him fighting at his natural weight here against Gavin Tucker coming off of a long layoff, hasn't been the most active fighter, spells bad news for Gavin Tucker. So Justin James, let's get a first round knockout from our boy James. Coming in next here would be Derek Lewis at 8,700. We just talked about him. This is a guy that has the ability to finish anyone. And I mean, if we get a James knockout, if we get a Pitolo knockout and a Derek Lewis knockout, we're looking really, really good in GPPs. And that's what I'm aiming for. So let's hope that Derek Lewis gets the finish. After Derek Lewis, I'm going to go with Beneil Dariush at 9,100, who I just think has a big advantage here over Scott Holtzman. Holtzman is a game opponent, but Dariush is, this guy finished Drew Dober. He's just been on a nice little streak here in the UFC, and I think he keeps it up here. Dariush by finish would be nice, and I think he has an advantage no matter where this fight goes. Striking, jiu-jitsu on the ground. So lock him in your lineup at 9,100. And then my last fighter here. And you got to give me a little slack here because I don't know the salary yet, but I will tell you that Kevin Holland will be added to this DraftKings slate, and he will probably be priced anywhere from 9,200 to 9,500. If he's 9,500 or below, he fits in this lineup that I'm giving you here. So I will have Kevin Holland in my lineup at that expected price point. He's taking on a fighter that just fought less than a week ago, and he has a significant size advantage over him. He's a good striker, better wrestler, better jiu-jitsu, better grappling, has finishing potential, so I want to lock him in my lineup. Kevin Holland, if it's 9,500, 9,400, 9,300, 9,200, doesn't make a difference. I'm throwing him in my lineup and expecting him to pull out a victory. So that is that, boys and girls. Thank you for tuning back into the Manchise. Hopefully this card doesn't turn into a shit show like the last one, and we can make some money here. Lock in those DFS lineups, man, and tune in for next week's video. If you want to check out the podcast, you can check out the podcast on Spotify, Apple, Google, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. It's the Manchise. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can. It's at the Manchise USA, all one word. Would appreciate if you could like and subscribe to this video. Trying to build up my channel here, and the best way to do that is if you guys like and subscribe my videos. And the best way to get you to like and subscribe my videos or subscribe to my videos is if I keep producing winners. We started off super hot here, lost the cup. We had a rough week 2 weeks ago, but we're gonna get back on the grind here with this card. So peace.